showers and thunderstorms today with strong southwesterly winds to 37 miles per hour.
It's a numbers game, especially for the situation that we're in. We're coming off of a high water event here 48 hours ago.
The outdoors is not a hobby. It's not our passion. It is our way of life. We make the perfect cast, slow our breathing to execute a perfect shot, spend hours researching locations and techniques. Regardless of effort, we fail.
Nice knot!
This series is not about incredible bites or trophy animals. Our goal here at Day One Outdoors is to educate our viewers utilizing new technology to offer a different perspective. Watch as we research new areas, plan out the day, and adjust to changing conditions. If not for other experienced outdoorsmen teaching me along the way, I wouldn't have this life. I owe it to them to pass this knowledge along. I owe it to you. Join us here on Day One Outdoors, and let's learn how to become more successful in the field and on the water from day one.
Welcome to Buoy 10. This is the Super Bowl of salmon fishing. And today we're out here to do a little scouting trip because it's July 31st and this fishery opens on August 1st right here behind that buoy. This is a world-renowned salmon fishery, and I'll tell you what, we got the exact weather that you can expect down here at the coast. We've had thunder and lightning this morning. It's blowing already at 8 o'clock in the morning, that northwest wind. The tide change just starting to happen. We have a marine layer. It's dumping rain. It's the Oregon coast, and it's time to catch some salmon. So what we're gonna do here today is we're gonna go through the entire 40 square mile area of this fishery from Buoy 10 all the way on up to Tongue Point and show you guys how to break it down, where to look for these fish, what details you need to focus in on, and how to target them. This first spot that we're stopping at right now is called Checkerboard. Now, why is it called Checkerboard? Because it looks like a checkerboard. Black and white markings there, and what it's signifying is an obstruction, a hazard to navigation, and that is the bottom Desdemona Sands. And Desdemona Sands runs all the way up to above Tongue Point. Now, if you're gonna be traveling between Hammond and Chinook, make sure that you drive your boat around the bottom end, the west end of the checkerboard. If you go up above that, you might have a bad day and find yourself up on a beach. At this marker to the south, we have Hammond. To the north, we have Chinook. Both us as anglers and the fish decide at this point whether they're gonna go up the Oregon side or up the Washington side. Typically, what most anglers do is on a bigger tide set, when there's more water moving, they fish the Washington side. And that's because it is a shallower side and there's less water that flushes in and out. Now, on each tide change here that happens every 6 to 8 hours, we have millions upon millions of gallons of water moving upstream and downstream. That is pushing a lot of fish upriver and downriver, and we need to figure out where they're going. So on those larger tides, people tend to fish the Washington side, so that way there's less current. And on smaller tides, like what we're having here for this opener, people tend to fish the Oregon side. Now, I want you guys to think of Buoy 10 not as a massive 40-mile expanse, but as a tributary river. And what I mean by that is when we're fishing, say, steelhead in the wintertime, what are we looking for? We're looking for seams, softer water, easier travel lanes. We're doing the same thing down here. So on those larger tides, when there's a lot of water flushing out, those fish will look for those inside corners outside of that fast current. So they're gonna look for those edges where they can travel a little bit easier and not have to work as hard. Now on the incoming tide, they're just going to be flushing in up higher in the water column and flying into the system into the estuary here. But as soon as the tide flips, like what it's doing here right now, those fish will start to suck down towards the bottom, trying to follow that colder water from the ocean and get down near the deck and find those inside corners out of the fast current. Because today's a scouting day, I'm going to be looking towards water temperature more than anything. And that's because I'm looking for fish that are transitioning. When the fish are freshly into the system here, they're going to be in that colder ocean water, closer down towards buoy 10 itself. As they start to go through osmosis, their scales start to harden up, they're going to start pushing up higher into the system and getting into warmer river water. I'm trying to find that mesh between the two. That is where most fish tend to hang out and where you're going to find the bulk of the run. Right now I'm in 66, 67 degree water. I think because of this wind, I'm going to go check out that wash inside. We got an outgoing tide. And again, I'm scouting here today, trying to get ready for the opener tomorrow. I want to go over towards the church hole over here. We're going to take a look at that, go on that 30-foot line. We'll talk about how to fish that and when to fish that, and see if we can't find a couple on the graph. We've just made it up here to the church hole. Now, I'm sure a lot of you folks have heard that name before, but what you may not know is that the church hole is actually about a 5-mile long troll. It's a lot of water. So what we do out here is we've actually broken up that entire troll into different areas. Now, first, right below the bridge, we have the RV park. Then when we're talking to folks, we go from the RV park down to Red Roof, then the church and the fort. So anytime we're trying to chase that cell phone bite, if a guy just says, yeah, hey, they're biting a church hole, well, where? It's a 5-mile long troll, and if you started at the bridge, by the time you got down to the fort, it could be an hour later. So anytime that you're talking to your buddies out there, make sure you get as much information as possible. Now, what I'm doing here, I stopped in this 68 degree water because that's where I think a lot of these fish are gonna be transitioning. And if you look right here, that is what I'm going after. I'm getting a decent mark right there and a couple of decent marks right there. They're not too big, but those are definitely fish in the part of the water column that I'm looking for. So I'm starting out here in the 60 feet of water out here because I want to see how the water temperature is stacking. So we're at the first part of the outgoing tide, and that river water, because it is warmer and it is not salt water, it stays on top. Because the saltwater ocean water is salty and cold, it is actually dropping down lower in the water column. So you get the river water over top of the salt water. And if you look right here at my graph, right there about 10 to 20 feet down, you can see a little bit of fuzz, and that is that river water going over top of that salt water. And you can also see where that line is in the water column by where the bait and the fish are stacking. So if you look at my screen right now, I'm getting a lot of marks that could be salmon around 20 feet deep, and then all of the bait, all the anchovies are hanging down around 40, 50 feet, or even all the way on down to the bottom. So that is telling me a lot. This first part of the outgoing tide, those fish are not staying up 15 feet or shallower. They're dropping down with that salt water. And there they are stacking up right in that little area there from 20 to 30 feet down. So when is the best time to fish here at the church hole? Well, in all reality, you can catch fish here just about at any tide, whether it's a big tide or small tide, outgoing, incoming. There's always fish hanging out in this area just because it's such a big expanse of water. A lot of time guys will start down there towards Checkerboard on the incoming tide and follow those fish up on that inside edge along Desdemona Sands in that about 10 to 30 feet of water. Then as that tide's really starting to flush in, they'll stack up here in front of the bridge, nose into that current, let the water flush by them and bring in new fish to them. So they'll just sit there and hold and let the fish come to them. Then as the tide begins to flip, this edge, that same edge, that 30-foot line against Desdemona Sands, right over here to the south of us, is a very, very popular troll, especially when you get those bigger tides, because again, on this side of the river, there's less current than on the Oregon side. So you get those big tide exchanges, like 7, 8, 9 footers on the outgoing tide. A lot of times you'll see boats stacking up on that 30-foot line from the bridge all the way on down 5 miles down to the fort. It's a great, nice, easy troll along the sand, and it's a very productive area as well.
Fishfield is your one-stop shop online for the gear you need here in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. From salmon and steelhead saltwater, trout and kokanee, even crabbing. Visit fishfield.com today to place an order with no sales tax and have the gear you need shipped fast. Fishfield.com, we have what the Northwest outdoorsman needs.
Every once in a while, a new lure comes along that catches every angler's attention. It could be because of all the irresistible colors and finishes, or the patented skip beat action. Or maybe it's the wide variety of sizes designed for salmon, trout, walleye, steelhead, mackinaw, and more. But just for the record, we know one thing for certain. We didn't design the maglip to catch fishermen. Yakima Bait Company.
Welcome to the calm waters up here around Shipwreck. Now, I want you to be very mindful of something. It might be calm right here, but I'll tell you what, the rest of the river is still rough and getting rougher as the tide's running out. The reason why it's calm right here now is because of this hill in behind me. Most of the time we get a northwest wind out here at Buoy 10, and that hill right there keeps this water nice and calm even right now during an outgoing tide. So, yes, it's beautiful right here, but just be aware that the rest of the river is getting bigger as the tide continues to ebb. When you hear people talk about fishing above the bridge on the Washington side, most of the time you hear them say, hey, I'm up here at Shipwreck. Well, Shipwreck is actually a pretty big area with lots of different water that you can fish. There's deep water down there by the bridge. Right here, we're sitting on top of a sunken island. Over there, just a little bit to the south, is another channel, and then you get up on the humps and the flat up there on top of Desdemona Sands. So when do you fish? Well, right at the bottom of the outgoing tide, as it's starting to flush up, for the most part, those fish will be down a little bit lower, maybe at the bridge or even below the bridge, and they'll start to flush up with that tide. So I like to start down in that deeper water and then start working my way up to fishing on top of this sunken island that we're on right now. You'll go from 60 feet all the way up into 10 feet. And so you just follow those fish as they're getting flushed up on top of this sunken island here. If those fish are in that deep water and getting flushed up on top of this sunken island here, you'll have about 2 or 3 hours to target them before they spread out and start making their way up towards those ditches and the channels further up. Now, if you're not familiar with this area, be very, very careful as you get above Shipwreck heading upstream. That's because there are a lot of these little channels and ditches, but that also means that there are a lot of sandbars. So be very careful, and just because you see other boats there doesn't mean that they know where they're going either. So go slow. I always tell people don't go any faster than you want to hit something, because these sandbars, they go from 30 feet to 2 feet in a matter of a couple of yards. It happens fast. So as that tide goes, those fish will flush up into all those channels. We hit high slack, and that is probably one of the more popular times that people come up and fish this area is at high slack, first part of the outgo. They'll run all the way up to the top of this sunken island here and start trolling along this 30-foot line, and then jump over to all the different ditches and channels, fingers that go up into Desdemona Sands. Let's take a quick look at the map here so I can show you exactly what I'm talking about. Here's the bridge, and this is upstream and downstream. And right now we're straight out from the Shipwreck itself. So if I zoom in here a little, there is the sunken island that I'm talking about. So those fish will start down here in this deep water at the bottom of the tide and start flushing up on top of this sunken island. And then as we get later on in the tide, they come up into all these fingers and ditches up in this area here. And then as we hit high slack, a lot of times you'll find some fish over here on the humps above the bridge, right above the bridge, in that 15 to 20 feet of water. As we hit high slack and the tide starts to run out, we will fish higher up in these ditches, but mostly you'll see boats trolling along the sunken island here in this 30-foot of water, following those fish as they flush out with the tide and chasing that water temperature. So we just finished talking up here about how and when to fish the Shipwreck area, but what if you get a phone call and the bite is red hot over at the tankers, over where all the ships are anchored up on the Oregon side. How do you get across from the Washington side to the Oregon side? We got to cross over Desdemona Sands, which again is a massive sandbar. There's a very specific path to get from the Washington side to the Oregon side, and it follows along the bridge. We've made it about 3/4 of the way across from Washington back over to Oregon. When you get about this far across the short segment of the bridge, about 3/4 of the way, you're gonna run into two different sandbars. We have the sandbar coming in from Desdemona Sands up here to your east, and then you have the sandbar that's right up along the bridge as it starts to gain back elevation going into Oregon. So what you do when you get here to this part of the bridge, if you look directly over there towards Oregon, you'll see Astor Column. All you have to do is, once you're traveling along the bridge, just stay within 20 yards of the bridge from Washington all the way over here. Once you get 3/4 of the way across, turn the bow of the boat right at Astor Column and you can get across. However, I will suggest that you do this very slowly. This sandbar changes every single year, so make sure you go slow and create a good path that you can trust each time that you cross from Oregon to Washington and back. A lot of folks like to trust their graph, especially the maps that come preloaded onto their screens. However, these are not accurate. Again, the sands change quickly every single year. Right now it's showing me that we're on top of dry land. I'm actually in about 20 feet of water. So the best thing to do is to create that path that you know and that you can trust, looking at your slug trail on your screen and knowing exactly where you can go back and forth between Oregon and Washington. Again, go slow the first time, keep an eye on your depth, save that track, and then you can always safely get across from Oregon to Washington and back. And that will also help you when the fog rolls in, because when it does, you're not always able to see Astor Column.
Salmon swim up to 3,000 miles to return to their exact place of birth to reproduce. Well, most of the time.
This area right here is commonly called the tanker troll, and that's because we have all these tanker ships that anchor up right here. This spot is really commonly fished at the high slack. Right as the tide starts to run out, a lot of folks will come over here and fish the stretch from Tongue Point all the way on down to the bridge. It's a really nice, easy troll from 25 to 40 feet of water, and it is very, very productive on that tide change from high slack to the first part of the outgo. Now on bigger tides, this current speed will pick up and you can be trolling at 5-6 miles an hour, and it's really difficult to manage your depth. So typically you want to be up here right at the tide change before you get to max ebb and that current's ripping really hard. The bite will slow down the further you get into that outgoing tide. Now up above us here is Tongue Point, and that can be some of the best fishing all season long here down at Buoy 10, but it's usually only good for about 1 or 2 days. And what you want to look for are the smallest tide sets, the smallest 2-3 days worth of tides. Right as those tides bottom out, we get that 2-foot, 3-foot exchange. The day or two afterwards, where they slowly start to build, that's when those fish will stack up there. The last place that we're going to talk about is the green can line from the bridge all the way on down here to the Hammond area. Now, first and foremost, this green can line is a marker. It's a boundary line for Young's Bay itself. We are not allowed to fish south of that green can line from the bridge all the way down here to the sawdust pile. So if you are fishing that green line, make sure your boat stays north of those green cans, an imaginary line going from each green can to the next, because if you come inside, they do patrol out here and they will write you a ticket. So a good time to fish that green can line is once you've been up there at that tanker troll, the bite starts slowing down, those fish might have flushed back downstream a little ways, so come below the bridge and you can follow along that green can line. Now up there at the bridge itself, it's gonna be a little bit deeper water, 50, 60 foot, but as you make your way down here, that green can line, if you're up next to it, if you're close to those cans, it's gonna get down into about 20 feet of water. So just pay attention to your electronics, trust what you're seeing, and adjust your depths accordingly, where you're seeing them on your graph, and of course the depth of water that you're in. Now once you get down here towards the Hammond area and sawdust pile, this is a great area to fish during the incoming tide, especially on larger tides. And that is true over in Chinook and Coho too. Those two areas are very similar. They're great places to fish on incoming tide because the fish just get flushed to you. So you can start right at the bottom of the tide. As it starts to push in, you just nose into the current and hold there, and you can do that from the sawdust pile all the way on down to Buoy 20, or over there in Chinook along the piling rows around the green markers, all the way down to Coho. And all you have to do is just hold your course, hold right there in the current, let your gear do all the work, and let the fish come to you. Now that we've gone around and talked about each location in this massive 40 square mile fishery, let's get out of this chop, head back to the dock, and talk about tides and how important they are for when fish show up and how you should target them on each type of tide set. Let's head on in through this nasty, nasty wind chop. Here we go. Because this is an estuary fishery, tides are extremely important. Now, most folks are not like us fishing guides that you're not down here for the entire month. So you need to pick your vacation days and be very precise on what type of fish you want to target and when you want to set those days up to be down here to enjoy this fishery. So how do you know when to go fishing? Well, these tides are going every 6 to 8 hours, and they'll push those fish 15, 20 miles every single tide change. So these fish move a lot too. What happens is on every full moon and every new moon, those are your biggest tides. That's where you see the 7 to 10 foot exchanges down here. That's the most amount of water flushing in and out of the estuary. On your half moons, that's when you're gonna get your smallest tides, like what we're seeing right now, your smaller 2 to 4 foot exchanges. Typically, now again, this is typically, doesn't always occur this way. I've seen it happen different ways, but in most cases, when you've hit your peak tide right after the full or new moon, and those tides start to drop, so they start to become smaller, we tend to see more Chinook come into the estuary. Now when we are getting up to our largest tides, those 7 to 10 foot exchanges, as they're growing, coming up to the peak, and then a couple days after, so that 4 or 5 day set where they're hitting 9, 10 feet on those tide exchanges, that's when we typically see more coho come into the bay. So what do you want to target? Do you want to target Chinook or coho? For Chinook, falling tides. For coho, the biggest tides that we have on the full or new moon, that's when you want to come down here. Now first, the Chinook come into the estuary early on in August. The coho tend to show up around the 3rd or the 4th week. So that gives you an idea of when you need to start looking at those tides as well. It depends on each year on what the regulations will allow us to do. For this year, the regulations are that it's hatchery Chinook only through the first 10 days, and then after that, it goes to any Chinook. Coho for this season always have to be fin clipped. But if you're gonna come out here and try and target coho, later on in August is gonna be best. And frankly, the Chinook numbers keep on increasing as the month progresses. But some seasons, the Chinook fishery is over by around the 20th to 25th. So you need to plan your vacation days accordingly. My game plan for the August 1st opener here tomorrow is gonna be tough. And that's because the best part about being down here working every single day is that you can see how the fish move differently on each tide set, so you can pinpoint where they should be the next day. It being a hard opener like this, no idea where they are. We went out there and tried to scout it out a little bit. We kind of saw fish here or there, but it's gonna be a tough one. This is not my favorite tide set. I personally don't do very well on these smaller tides. What I think is gonna happen is these are smaller tides, they're plus tides, which means that there's more ocean water pushing up against the river. So I think the fish are gonna be up in the water column, but they're gonna be scattered. They're gonna be spread out. And I don't like that. I like the bigger tides that push the fish into a corner, and when I find them, I know that they're gonna stay right there. So tomorrow, it's gonna be incoming tide first thing in the morning until about 8:30, 9 o'clock, and then outgoing tide the rest of the day. So I think what I might do is, boy, we're gonna be covering a lot of water, because I think my game plan for tomorrow is to start over on the Washington side at the bridge, nose into that current as it's funneling past us, see what we see. If we get on fish, then we'll stay on the Washington side up to Shipwreck and then follow back down when the tide flips. But if we don't see any fish, don't get any action, no bites, and the graph is kind of quiet, I'm gonna run over to the Oregon side, because the tide's always a little bit later, about half hour to an hour later on the Oregon side. Sit right here in front of the bridge and pick up the last part of that incoming tide and hopefully find a few fish. Now, we are at the smallest tide set. It's really early in August, so they shouldn't be there quite yet. But if I don't get anything on the Washington side, nothing happens here on the Oregon side, I might risk it and go up above Tongue Point and see if those fish are starting to keg up there. The nice thing about fishing early on in August is that there are still late springers coming in, there are summer snook, and the fall fish are all starting to pile in here. So you have a chance at 3 different runs early on in the season. I just don't know if they're gonna be kegged up there high enough. The water temp is definitely warm enough to slow them down, but it's a gamble. Tomorrow kicks off the Super Bowl of salmon fishing here at the mouth of the Columbia River, and I can't wait to get started.